Tonight, we're going somewhere most history books won't take you. We're going back to Africa before the colonial maps, before the borders were drawn by men in European conference rooms, before the word primitive was ever attached to this continent. Before we start, like and subscribe for more content like this. If you grew up in the Western world, you probably learned a certain version of this history. Tribal villages in the jungle, simple people living in huts, a dark continent waiting to be discovered, civilized, brought into the light by explorers who planted their flags and claimed they'd found something new. It's a clean story. Civilized and uncivilized, advanced and backward, discoverers and the discovered. But it's not the truth. The truth is more complicated, more magnificent. The people who built civilizations across this continent for thousands of years weren't waiting to be discovered. They were trading with the world while Europe was still fumbling through its dark ages. They were building cities that rivaled anything in medieval Europe. They were creating art, developing technologies, establishing trade networks that stretched across continents and oceans. They minted their own currencies, wrote their own histories, governed themselves with sophisticated political systems that would have impressed any Renaissance prince. Tonight, we're not going to reduce them to a footnote. We're not going to pretend they were primitive. We're just going to walk through their world, the world that existed here for thousands of years, the kingdoms that rose and fell and left their mark on human history in ways that most people never learned about. So settle in. Let your breathing slow. Let the modern stereotypes fade away. We're going back, way back to a continent of vast savannas and dense forests, of rivers that carried trade goods for thousands of miles, of cities that glittered with gold and echoed with the sounds of commerce from 3 continents. This is what African kingdoms were actually like. Let's begin. Before we meet the kingdoms, we need to see the continent they inhabited. Close your eyes for a moment and forget everything you think you know about Africa. Forget the single story you were told. Forget the images of poverty and primitiveness that dominated your textbooks. Erase all of it. What's left is something most Western education systems never bothered to teach you. Diversity. Geographic, cultural, economic diversity on a scale that dwarfs Europe. Africa is massive. You could fit the United States, China, India, and most of Europe inside its borders and still have room left over. It's the second largest continent on Earth, home to every climate zone imaginable. In the north, the Sahara, not a wasteland, never a wasteland, but a sea of sand with its own highways, its own rhythms, its own people who learned to cross it the way sailors learned to cross the Atlantic. Camel caravans carrying salt, gold, slaves, ideas, moving between oases that functioned as ports in an ocean of sand. The Sahara wasn't a barrier. It was a bridge connecting North Africa to the Mediterranean world and sub-Saharan Africa to everything beyond. In the west, forests so dense they created their own weather. Rain forests where civilizations learned to thrive in the green twilight beneath canopies that blocked the sky. Rivers cutting through the jungle, the Niger, the Senegal, the Gambia, waterways that carried trade and culture for thousands of miles. In the east, highlands and plains, the Great Rift Valley splitting the continent like a wound, lakes so deep they held species found nowhere else on Earth. Grasslands where pastoralists herded cattle and built societies around livestock wealth. Mountains that rose high enough to hold snow on the equator. In the south, more diversity. Desert in the west, grassland in the center, fertile coasts in the east. Every environment demanding its own adaptations, producing its own cultures, its own innovations. And everywhere, resources. Gold in quantities that would make conquistadors weep. Salt worth its weight in gold in regions far from the sea. Iron ore that African smiths were working while Europe was still in the Bronze Age. Copper, ivory, exotic woods, spices. The land was rich. The people who lived on it knew it. And they built civilizations that turned those resources into wealth, power, and culture that deserves to be remembered. Now let's meet the kingdoms themselves. And the first thing you need to understand is that there wasn't just one. When we talk about African kingdoms, we're talking about hundreds of distinct political entities that rose and fell over 3,000 years. Some lasted for centuries. Others burned bright and fast. Some controlled territories larger than most European nations. Others were city-states that punched above their weight through trade and diplomacy. Let's start in the west with Ghana. Not modern Ghana, the medieval empire that existed hundreds of miles northwest of the current nation that borrowed its name. The Ghana Empire, also called Wagadu, flourished from roughly 300 to 1200 AD. While Europe was struggling through the collapse of Rome and the chaos of the early Middle Ages, Ghana was building an empire on gold and salt. The king of Ghana controlled the gold fields to his south and the salt mines to his north. He didn't need to mine either one himself. He just taxed the trade, Every ounce of gold heading north taxed. Every block of salt heading south taxed. The revenue was staggering. Arab travelers who visited Ghana described a king who lived in a palace decorated with sculptures and glass windows, who held court surrounded by horses draped in gold cloth, who could field an army of 200,000 men, including 40,000 archers. One account describes the king's court, 10 pages standing on his right, each holding a shield and a gold-mounted sword. The sons of vassal kings, their hair decorated with gold, sitting at the king's feet. The governor of the city sitting on the ground before him. Around him, ministers in splendid garments. At the door, guard dogs wearing collars of gold and silver. This wasn't a tribal chief in a grass hut. This was a sophisticated monarchy with all the ceremony and power of any European kingdom. When Ghana fell, not to invasion but to environmental change and internal pressures, it was replaced by something even larger. Mali. The Mali Empire at its peak in the 14th century was the largest empire in West African history. It stretched from the Atlantic coast to the bend of the Niger River, encompassing an area larger than Western Europe. And it was fabulously, almost incomprehensibly wealthy. The wealth came from gold. Mali controlled the richest gold fields in the world at that time. So much gold flowed through Mali that it destabilized economies in Egypt and the Middle East. We know this because of one man's pilgrimage. In 1324, Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali, made the Hajj to Mecca. He didn't travel light. His caravan included 60,000 people. He brought 80 camels, each carrying 300 pounds of gold. He brought 500 slaves, each carrying a golden staff weighing 6 pounds. As he traveled through Cairo, he spent and gave away so much gold that he caused massive inflation. The price of gold in Egypt didn't recover for a decade. Think about that. One man's spending spree crashed the economy of the most important commercial center in the Mediterranean world. That's the scale of wealth we're talking about. But Mali wasn't just rich, it was sophisticated. Timbuktu, one of Mali's major cities, became a center of Islamic learning that rivaled anything in the Muslim world. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu had 25,000 students at its peak. Its library held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on subjects ranging from astronomy to medicine to law to literature. Scholars came from across the Islamic world to study there, to teach there, to debate with the intellectuals who made Timbuktu their home. The manuscripts survive. Hundreds of thousands of them, hidden by families when later invasions threatened, preserved in private libraries, slowly being cataloged and digitized by modern scholars. They're written in Arabic and in African languages using Arabic script. They cover every subject imaginable. Legal opinions, astronomical calculations, poetry, history, theology, medicine. This wasn't oral tradition preserved by griots, though that existed too and was equally valuable. This was written scholarship, academic work that proves beyond any doubt that West African kingdoms were participating in the intellectual life of the medieval world at the highest level. When Mali declined, Songhai rose. The Songhai Empire in the 15th and 16th centuries became even larger than Mali. Its capital, Gao, sat on the Niger River and controlled trade routes that stretched from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. Songhai's most famous ruler, Askia Mohammed, who ruled from 1493 to 1528, built an administrative system that would impress any modern bureaucrat. He divided his empire into provinces, each governed by an appointed official. He created a professional army, a navy to patrol the Niger River, a system of weights and measures to standardize trade. He established Islamic law as the basis of his legal system while allowing local customs to continue where they didn't conflict. He built schools, encouraged scholarship, supported artists and poets. When he made his own Hajj to Mecca in 1496, he brought so much gold that he was compared to Mansa Musa. And like Mansa Musa, he spent lavishly on his empire when he returned, building mosques, funding schools, establishing systems that would outlast him. Songhai fell in 1591, not to a rival African kingdom, but to a Moroccan invasion. The Moroccans had something new: firearms. Thousands of musketeers crossed the Sahara and shattered Songhai's army at the Battle of Tondibai. The empire collapsed, but even in defeat, the scale of what Songhai had been was evident. The Moroccans found cities with populations in the tens of thousands, libraries with collections that took years to catalog, trade networks that connected 3 continents. Now let's move east, to the Swahili coast, where a different kind of civilization emerged. Not a single empire, but a network of city-states that stretched from modern-day Somalia to Mozambique. Kilwa, Mombasa, Zanzibar, Sofala, Mogadishu. These weren't villages. They were cosmopolitan trading cities built from coral stone, with multi-story buildings, indoor plumbing, and harbors that welcomed ships from Arabia, Persia, India, and China. The Swahili city-states emerged around 800 AD and flourished for nearly 1,000 years. They were Muslim, but their Islam was blended with African traditions in ways that created something unique. They spoke Swahili, a Bantu language that borrowed heavily from Arabic, a linguistic fusion that reflected the cultural fusion happening in the streets and marketplaces. The wealth came from trade. The Swahili coast was the interface between the African interior and the Indian Ocean world. Gold from Zimbabwe, ivory from the interior, slaves unfortunately. Yes, slaves, this was part of the economy. All of it flowed through Swahili ports to destinations across the ocean. In return came silk from China, porcelain from Persia, spices from India, glass from Venice. Archaeologists excavating Swahili sites find artifacts from across the medieval world. Chinese coins, Persian pottery, Indian beads, Venetian glass. These cities were connected to global trade networks centuries before Europeans arrived. One visitor to Kilwa in the 14th century described it as one of the most beautiful cities in the world. The Sultan's palace, still partially standing today, was a massive coral stone structure with over 100 rooms, a swimming pool, and decorative elements that showed influences from across the Islamic world. The Great Mosque of Kilwa, built in the 13th century, could hold 1,000 worshippers. Its domed roof, its intricate stonework, its massive doors of carved wood, all of it spoke to wealth, sophistication, and connection to the broader Islamic world. Further south in the interior, another kingdom was rising, Great Zimbabwe. The name means houses of stone in the Shona language, and stone is what makes it remarkable. Between the 11th and 15th centuries, the people of Great Zimbabwe built the largest stone structures in sub-Saharan Africa. The Great Enclosure, the most famous structure, has walls 36 feet high and 20 feet thick in places. The walls are made from granite blocks, fitted together without mortar, in courses so precise that they've stood for 800 years. The complex covers 1,800 acres. At its peak, it housed perhaps 18,000 people. The wealth came from gold and cattle. Great Zimbabwe controlled gold mines and trade routes that connected the interior to the Swahili coast. Excavations have found artifacts from China, Persia, and Arabia, proof that Zimbabwe's trade network stretched across the Indian Ocean. When Europeans first encountered the ruins in the 19th century, they couldn't believe Africans had built them. They invented elaborate theories. Maybe it was the Phoenicians. Maybe it was the Queen of Sheba. Maybe it was a lost white civilization. Anything but the obvious truth that Africans had built a sophisticated stone city without European help or influence. The racism was so embedded that when archaeologists found evidence that Great Zimbabwe was unquestionably African, some colonial governments suppressed the findings. They couldn't let the narrative change. They needed Africans to be primitive to justify what they were doing to them. But the stones don't lie. Great Zimbabwe stands as proof that African kingdoms built monumental architecture, controlled long-distance trade, and created urban centers that functioned for centuries. Now let's go north, to the Horn of Africa, where Ethiopia built a civilization that never fell to colonial rule. Ethiopia, or Abyssinia as it was sometimes called, has a history stretching back 3,000 years. The Kingdom of Aksum, which flourished from roughly 100 to 940 AD, was a major power in the ancient world. It minted its own coins, gold, silver, and bronze, with inscriptions in Greek and Ge'ez, the ancient Ethiopian language. It built massive stone obelisks, some over 100 feet tall, carved from single pieces of granite. It traded with Rome, with Persia, with India. It converted to Christianity in the 4th century, making it one of the oldest Christian nations on earth. When Aksum fell, it was replaced by a series of dynasties that maintained Ethiopian independence for centuries. The Zagwe dynasty built the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela in the 12th century, 11 churches carved entirely from solid rock, below ground level, connected by tunnels and trenches. Each church was carved from a single piece of stone, hollowed out from the top down, with columns, windows, and decorative elements all carved from the living rock. They're still standing, still in use, still breathtaking. The Solomonic dynasty, which claimed descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, ruled Ethiopia from 1270 to 1974. They maintained a written literary tradition, preserved ancient manuscripts, built castles and palaces, and most remarkably, they fought off every attempt at conquest. When Italy tried to colonize Ethiopia in 1896, Ethiopian forces destroyed the Italian army at the Battle of Adwa. It was the first time an African nation had defeated a European colonial power in battle. Ethiopia remained independent while the rest of Africa was carved up by European powers. That independence, that unbroken continuity, that's part of African history too. Let's talk about trade because that's what connected these kingdoms to each other and to the world. The trans-Saharan trade routes were the arteries of West African commerce for over 1,000 years. Camel caravans, sometimes thousands of camels strong, crossed the desert carrying gold, slaves, ivory, and cola nuts north. They returned with salt, cloth, horses, and books. The journey could take months. The risks were enormous. Sandstorms, raiders, thirst, getting lost in a landscape with no landmarks. But the profits made it worthwhile. A block of salt bought in the Sahara for a few coins could be sold in the forest kingdoms for its weight in gold. A slave bought in the south could be sold in North Africa for 10 times the purchase price. The moral horror of that trade can't be ignored, and we'll come back to it. But economically, the trans-Saharan trade created wealth on a scale that transformed West Africa. The Indian Ocean trade was equally important for East Africa. Monsoon winds made it possible to sail from Africa to India and back in a single year. Dhows, traditional Arab sailing vessels, carried goods and people across thousands of miles of open ocean. African ivory was prized in India and China. African gold ended up in Persian jewelry and Chinese treasuries. In return, African elites wore silk from China, ate from Persian pottery, and displayed porcelain that had traveled halfway around the world. This wasn't primitive barter. This was sophisticated long-distance trade with credit systems, standardized currencies, and merchant networks that spanned continents. Cowrie shells from the Maldives became currency in West Africa. Gold dust was measured with standardized weights. Merchants kept written records of transactions. Trade diasporas, communities of merchants living far from home, established themselves in foreign cities to facilitate commerce. The wealth this generated wasn't just for kings. A merchant class emerged, people who became rich through trade, who built houses, supported artists, commissioned works of literature. A middle class, in other words, in medieval Africa. Now we need to talk about slavery because it's part of this story and ignoring it would be dishonest. Slavery existed in Africa long before Europeans arrived. It existed in most pre-modern societies. Captives from wars were enslaved. People who couldn't pay debts were enslaved. Criminals were enslaved. In many African societies, slaves could be integrated into families, could own property, could even rise to positions of power. It wasn't the chattel slavery that would develop in the Americas, where people were property with no rights and their children inherited that status forever. But it was still slavery. People owned other people. People were bought and sold. People suffered. When the trans-Saharan trade developed, African slaves were sold north into the Islamic world. Millions of people over more than 1,000 years. The exact numbers are debated, but estimates range from 9 to 17 million people enslaved and transported across the Sahara or shipped from East African ports. Then Europeans arrived and the scale changed. The Atlantic slave trade, which began in the 15th century and didn't end until the 19th, transported an estimated 12 million Africans to the Americas. Millions more died in the process of capture, the march to the coast, the holding pens, the voyage across the Atlantic. African kingdoms participated in this trade. They sold captives to European traders. Some kingdoms grew wealthy and powerful specifically because they controlled the slave trade. The Kingdom of Dahomey, the Ashanti Empire, the Kingdom of Congo, all of them were deeply involved in selling people to Europeans. This is uncomfortable history. It complicates the narrative. It means we can't simply say Africans were victims and Europeans were villains. Both were true. Africans were victimized on a scale that's hard to comprehend, and some Africans were complicit in victimizing others. The slave trade devastated Africa. It drained the continent of millions of people in their prime working years. It created warfare as kingdoms raided each other for captives. It distorted economies, making it more profitable to sell people than to develop other industries. It created dependencies on European goods, guns especially, that made African kingdoms vulnerable to later conquest. But it didn't define Africa. The kingdoms we've discussed built their wealth primarily on gold, salt, ivory, and other trade goods. Slavery was part of their economy, a terrible part, but not the whole story. Let's talk about what daily life looked like in these kingdoms. If you lived in Timbuktu in the 15th century, you woke in a city of perhaps 100,000 people. Your house, if you were wealthy, was built from mud brick with a flat roof where you could sleep on hot nights. The streets were narrow, winding, designed to provide shade from the brutal sun. You heard the call to prayer 5 times a day from minarets that rose above the city. You saw scholars in their robes hurrying to the university. You saw merchants from across the Sahara, Berbers and Arabs and Tuaregs, their camels loaded with goods. You saw slaves, yes, carrying water, building houses, doing the hard labor that kept the city running. You saw women in the marketplace selling vegetables, cloth, pottery. You saw children running through the streets, playing the same games children play everywhere. If you were a scholar, you spent your days in study. Reading manuscripts, copying texts, debating with other scholars about points of law or theology or science. You might write commentaries on classical texts. You might compose poetry. You might teach students who came from across West Africa to learn from you. If you were a merchant, your days were spent in negotiation, meeting with other traders, examining goods, calculating prices, arranging credit. You dealt in multiple currencies, converted between them, assessed the quality of gold dust by weight and color. You wrote contracts, kept records, built relationships with merchants in other cities. If you were a craftsperson, you worked with your hands. Blacksmiths forged tools and weapons. Weavers created intricate textiles. Leather workers made sandals, bags, book bindings. Jewelers worked gold into intricate designs. Your skills were passed down through families, through guilds, through apprenticeships that lasted years. The food you ate depended on where you were. In the Savannah kingdoms, millet and sorghum were staples, ground into flour and made into porridge or flatbread. You ate meat when you could afford it, goat, chicken, beef from the cattle that represented wealth in many societies. You flavored your food with spices that came from across the Sahara. You drank water, milk, sometimes palm wine or millet beer. In the forest kingdoms, yams and plantains dominated. Cassava after it was introduced from the Americas. Fish from rivers and the coast, palm oil for cooking. Cola nuts, bitter and caffeinated, chewed for energy and used in ceremonies. On the Swahili coast, rice became a staple, influenced by Indian Ocean trade. You ate fish, obviously, and coconut and fruits that grew in the tropical climate. You flavored your food with spices from India and the Middle East, creating a cuisine that was distinctly Swahili, African and Asian at the same time. Clothing varied by region and status. In the Sahel kingdoms, cotton was common, woven into cloth and dyed with indigo to create the deep blue that became associated with West African nobility. The wealthy wore robes of imported silk. They decorated themselves with gold jewelry, amulets with Quranic verses, leather goods tooled with intricate designs. In the forest kingdoms, bark cloth was traditional before cotton became common. Woven raffia created textiles with geometric patterns. As trade increased, imported cloth became a status symbol. On the Swahili coast, people wore kangas and kikois, cotton wraps influenced by Indian and Arab styles. Women wore gold and silver jewelry, coral beads, perfumes made from local and imported ingredients. Music filled these cities. Drums of every size and type, from small hand drums to massive ceremonial drums that required multiple people to play. String instruments, the kora with its calabash body and 21 strings, the ngoni ancestor of the banjo. Wind instruments, flutes and horns. And voices, always voices, singing, chanting, telling stories, preserving history. The griots, the oral historians of West Africa, were walking libraries. They memorized genealogies going back centuries. They knew the histories of kingdoms, the deeds of heroes, the lessons of the past. They performed at ceremonies, advised rulers, taught the young. What they preserved was as valuable as anything in the libraries of Timbuktu, just stored in memory instead of on paper. Then everything changed. Not all at once, not in a single cataclysm, but gradually, relentlessly over centuries. The Portuguese arrived on the West African coast in the 1440s. At first, they were just another trading partner. African kingdoms dealt with them the way they dealt with Arab and Berber traders for centuries. They negotiated, traded set terms. But the Portuguese wanted something different. They wanted direct access to the gold. They wanted to bypass the African middlemen. They wanted control. They didn't get it, not at first. African kingdoms were too strong, too organized. The Portuguese built forts on the coast with African permission, paid rent, followed local customs. But they were learning the coastline, mapping the rivers, identifying weaknesses. Other Europeans followed. The Dutch, the British, the French. They competed with each other for access to African trade. They played African kingdoms against each other. They introduced guns, creating dependencies and escalating conflicts. The Atlantic slave trade grew. It became more profitable than gold, more profitable than anything. Kingdoms that participated grew wealthy and powerful. Kingdoms that refused were conquered by their neighbors who had European guns. The trans-Saharan trade declined. Why cross the desert when European ships could carry more goods faster and cheaper? The cities of the interior, places like Timbuktu, began to fade. The wealth flowed to the coast now, to the kingdoms that controlled the slave trade. Then in the 19th century, Europeans decided they wanted the land itself. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 carved up Africa on paper. European powers drew borders with rulers and pencils, dividing the continent among themselves without consulting a single African leader. What followed was conquest. The scramble for Africa, they called it. Within 30 years, almost the entire continent was under European control. Some kingdoms resisted. Ethiopia, as we mentioned, defeated Italy and remained independent. Some kingdoms fought wars that lasted years. The Ashanti fought the British through multiple wars before finally being conquered. The Zulu under Shaka built a military machine that terrified European settlers before being overwhelmed by British firepower. But most kingdoms fell quickly. The technological gap had become too wide. Maxim guns against spears, artillery against mud brick walls. European armies weren't large, but they didn't need to be. A few hundred men with modern weapons could defeat armies of thousands, and once conquered, the erasure began. European colonizers needed to justify what they'd done. They needed Africans to be primitive, backwards, uncivilized, so they rewrote the history. They claimed Great Zimbabwe was built by outsiders. They ignored the libraries of Timbuktu. They dismissed African political systems as tribal chaos. They took artifacts and put them in museums in London and Paris and Brussels, labeling them curiosities, primitive art, never acknowledging the sophistication of the cultures that created them. They drew new borders that split ethnic groups and threw rival groups together. They imposed European languages, European law, European education systems designed to create workers and administrators, not to preserve African culture. They extracted resources, gold, diamonds, rubber, copper, and sent the wealth back to Europe. The colonization of Africa was one of the great crimes of history. It was brutal, exploitative, racist to its core. It created poverty and instability that persists today, but it didn't erase what came before. The kingdoms fell, but they left traces. The manuscripts of Timbuktu survive. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe stand. The Swahili language is spoken by over 100 million people. Ethiopian Christianity continues unbroken. Oral traditions preserved by griots still tell the stories of Mali and Songhai. Modern African nations struggle with the legacy of colonialism, with borders that make no sense, with economies distorted by centuries of exploitation, with political systems imposed from outside. But they also carry forward the legacy of the kingdoms. The knowledge that Africans built civilizations, that they traded with the world, that they created art and literature and architecture that deserves to be remembered. The story we were told in school, the story of a dark continent waiting to be discovered, was a lie. A lie told to justify conquest, to make colonizers feel righteous, to keep Africans subjugated. The truth is that Africa was never dark. It was full of light, full of life, full of kingdoms that rose and fell and left their mark on history. And that truth, once you see it, changes everything. Sleep well, knowing that history is bigger and more complex than anyone taught you. That the human story includes these kingdoms, these traders, these scholars, these builders. They were here, they mattered, and they deserve to be remembered.